Hey guys, tonight we find ourselves journeying back thousands of years to the sun-drenched banks of the mighty Nile, into the majestic and mysterious world of ancient Egypt. Imagine the air thick with the scent of lotus flowers blooming along the riverbanks, the rich, dark smell of fertile mud left by the annual inundation, and perhaps the subtle, exotic fragrance of incense drifting from the direction of towering, distant temples. Picture vast golden pyramids piercing a brilliant turquoise sky, bustling marketplaces alive with 1,000 strange sounds, merchants haggling donkeys, braying children laughing, and the ever-present life-giving Nile itself a shimmering ribbon winding its way through an otherwise arid land. We're here tonight to uncover some of the rather peculiar and often quite ingenious ways the ancient Egyptians dealt with those members of society who couldn't quite keep their hands to themselves. Specifically the petty thieves who nipped and pilfered in the shadows of Pharaoh's grandeur. Honestly, between the all-powerful gods watching your every move, the meticulous eyes of the scribes recording every detail, and the rather direct methods of ensuring truth, you'd probably find yourself accidentally offending a sacred cat deity, or misplacing a single valuable fig and ending up in a papyrus load of trouble before your first Egyptian lunchtime. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It always means a lot to hear from you, so feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you step, metaphorically speaking, from your time-traveling felucca onto the warm, dusty earth of an ancient Egyptian town, perhaps somewhere bustling like Thebes or the great administrative heart of Memphis, the sheer antiquity of the place is almost palpable. Houses are built of sun-dried mud brick, cool within their flat roofs, often used for sleeping on warm nights. Narrow, winding alleyways teeming with life open onto vibrant marketplaces where goods from all corners of the known world, or at least Egypt's known world, are traded. You see people in simple white linen kilts or sheath dresses, their skin bronzed by the ever-present sun, perhaps adorned with colorful faience beads or simple copper amulets. And everywhere there are the symbols of a deeply spiritual and highly ordered society, towering temple pylons in the distance covered in intricate hieroglyphs, small household shrines, and a general sense that life here is lived in close communion with a vast pantheon of gods and goddesses. At the very heart of this ancient Egyptian worldview, underpinning every law, every social custom, every religious belief, is the profound concept of Ma'at. A mainstream historical fact that is absolutely crucial to understanding Egyptian justice is that Ma'at represented far more than just a single idea. It was the divine order, cosmic balance, truth, justice, righteousness, and the fundamental harmony that held the universe together. Personified as a goddess, often depicted with an ostrich feather upon her head, the feather of truth against which hearts would be weighed in the afterlife. Ma'at was the ideal towards which all Egyptian society strove. The pharaoh, as a divine king, was her chief champion on earth, his primary duty being to uphold Ma'at and to combat Isfet, or chaos and injustice in all its forms. Any crime, therefore, from the grandest act of treason down to the smallest act of petty theft, was seen not just as an offense against an individual victim, but as a disruption of Ma'at, a tear in the sacred fabric of existence that had to be mended. Forget merely innocent until proven guilty. In ancient Egypt, it was more like presumed to be living in accordance with Ma'at until you demonstrably mess with Ma'at, in which case prepare for some divinely sanctioned and meticulously recorded inconvenience. This meant that even what we might consider petty theft, filching a few onions from a neighbor's garden, swiping a tool from a work site, borrowing a length of linen from a washing line, or perhaps a baker subtly short-weighting his loaves, was taken seriously. It might not have invited the dramatic state-level responses reserved for tomb robbers or murderers, but it still represented a small injection of chaos, a minor wobbling of those all-important scales of justice. And the highly organized Egyptian state, with its legions of officials and its almost obsessive dedication to record-keeping. Thank Thoth, the ibis-headed god of scribes, for that had ways of dealing with such disturbances. Their legal system involved more gods as witnesses and guarantors than a particularly dramatic mythological family reunion. You wouldn't just swear on a holy book. You might find yourself swearing a complex oath invoking Osiris's left big toe, Horus's good eye, or Perhaps the sacredness of Pharaoh's favorite lucky scarab beetle. Religion and law were not separate spheres here. They were completely intertwined. Temples were not just places of worship. They were often major economic centers, landowners, and administrative hubs. Priests could act as judges, and temple precincts sometimes served as places where disputes were heard or oaths were administered. The gods were believed to be ever watchful, to witness all transgressions, and to ultimately ensure that Maat prevailed both in this life and very famously in the next. A quirky, though perhaps not entirely surprising tidbit of daily life is that ordinary Egyptians frequently wore protective amulets. Scarabs for rebirth, the Ankh for life, the Eye of Horus for protection and health, dedicated to various deities. These were intended to ward off evil sickness and misfortune, including one imagines the misfortune of being robbed, or for that matter, the misfortune of being caught robbing someone else. Ironically, if these amulets were made of semi-precious stones or famants, they themselves could become desirable targets for a particularly desperate or opportunistic petty thief, creating a whole new layer of cosmic irony. Egyptologists still debate the precise extent to which a formal codified set of written laws akin to a modern legal code governed all aspects of everyday justice for minor offenses across all the diverse nomes provinces and throughout all the long periods of ancient Egyptian history, as opposed to a system that relied more heavily on customary law, local precedent, and the ad hoc decisions of local councils, kenbet, or appointed officials. But what is clear is that you've stepped into a land where order divinely ordained and Pharaoh guaranteed is paramount. Every act, every transaction, every dispute occurs under the vast watchful gaze of the gods and within a framework designed to maintain cosmic harmony. The punishments for those who chose to upset this balance, even through seemingly small acts of thievery, were designed not just to penalize the offender, but to visibly and effectively restore Maat, to mend that tear in the fabric, and to remind everyone of the importance of living a life aligned with truth, order, and justice. The journey into how exactly they did that with all its peculiar and sometimes rather pointed methods is what we're about to explore. You've stepped into this ancient land of Egypt, a realm where the very air seems to hum with the principles of Maat, that divine order, truth, and cosmic balance which Pharaoh himself is sworn to uphold. Every aspect of life, from the grandest temple ceremony down to the most mundane daily transaction, is ideally meant to reflect this harmony. So when someone, even a humble villager or a lowly laborer, succumbs to the temptation of petty theft, perhaps pocketing a few extra dates from the communal store or accidentally walking off with a neighbor's pottery jar, they are doing more than just depriving someone of their property. They are in a small but significant way creating a ripple of isfet of chaos in that otherwise meticulously ordered universe. And in a society as organized and record-loving as ancient Egypt, you can be sure that such disturbances, even minor ones, rarely went unnoticed, or more importantly, unrecorded. This is where you encounter one of the most essential and often unsung figures of Egyptian administration and justice, the scribe. Imagine him typically clad in a simple white linen kilt, perhaps seated cross-legged on the ground or at a low wooden table, his tools of trade laid out before him. A wooden palette with wells for black and red ink often made from soot and ochre, a small water pot, and a selection of finely cut reed pens. His canvas, a roll of precious papyrus, or for more everyday jottings, perhaps a flat piece of limestone, or a pottery shard known as an ostracon. A mainstream historical fact is that scribes were the literate backbone of ancient Egyptian civilization. Highly trained from a young age, they were indispensable for everything from recording temple inventories and royal decrees, to drafting letters, calculating taxes, and crucially for our journey, meticulously documenting legal proceedings, witness statements, lists of stolen goods, and the judgments handed down in cases of theft, both grand and petty. Their version of "it's going on your permanent record" was quite literal, involving actual indelible ink on a very durable medium, ensuring your misdeeds had a good chance of outlasting your own mortal existence. But why, you might wonder? Go to all the trouble of recording the theft of, say, a few onions or a worn-out pair of sandals? Firstly, it was all about Maat. No tear in the fabric of divine order was too small to ignore if harmony was to be truly maintained. Secondly, the act of recording itself was a form of control. The knowledge that your actions, your name, and your subsequent punishment could be officially written down, preserved for posterity, or at least until the next stocktake of court documents, likely served as a deterrent for some. Would-be pilferers might think twice if they knew their momentary lapse in judgment could end up as a detailed entry in Scribe Amos's regrettable life choices ledger. You thought your office meeting minutes were sometimes overly detailed. Egyptian scribes were the original champions of meticulous, almost obsessive note-taking. You can almost picture an entry, day 3 of the month of Akhet, year 10 of His Majesty. King Ramesses won one slightly dented copper pot reported missing by the Lady Merit from her dwelling. Suspect the shifty-eyed Noct who was seen loitering nearby with an unusually pot-shaped bulge under his tunic. Witnesses to two exceptionally observant geese and a passing water carrier with an excellent memory for suspicious bulges. These scribal records would have been invaluable. If a dispute arose over a petty theft, the local council of elders, or officials, the Kenbet would rely on a scribe to document the proceedings. The names of the accuser and the accused, the nature of the item stolen, any witness testimony, often given under a solemn oath, as you'll discover the judgment of the council and the prescribed punishment. All would be carefully noted down. This created a record that could be referred to later, perhaps if the thief was a repeat offender, or if disputes arose about whether restitution had been properly made. For a society that built timeless monuments, like the pyramids, creating a fairly timeless record of your minor criminal career was probably well within their capabilities. These weren't just dry administrative lists, they were in a sense scrolls of shame for those found guilty. While general literacy wasn't widespread, the official reading out of a judgment, or the knowledge that your name was inscribed on a document detailing your transgression carried considerable social weight. It was a formal, lasting condemnation that went beyond mere village gossip. A quirky tidbit about scribal practice is their use of ostraca, those flakes of limestone or broken pieces of pottery. Because papyrus was relatively expensive and labor-intensive to produce, scribes often used these readily available flat surfaces for less formal writings, drafts of texts, quick calculations, school exercises, or even, it's plausible for taking initial notes during a local dispute or the investigation of a minor theft before committing the final official version to a more permanent papyrus scroll. Imagine a village scribe listening to a heated argument over a missing chicken, quickly jotting down key accusations and denials on a handy bit of broken pot before it all escalated into a full-blown feather-flying incident. Egyptologists still debate the precise literacy rates among the various strata of ancient Egyptian society, and consequently how directly the written contents of these detailed legal records and judgments would have been comprehended by the average peasant farmer or village artisan accused of, say, filching a neighbor's fishing net, versus having the pronouncements interpreted and conveyed to them orally by the scribes or officials presiding over their case. Regardless of who could read them, the existence of these records underscored the seriousness with which order was maintained. Before any peculiar punishment was meted out before the soles of your feet met the bastinado, or you were sentenced to haul stones for Pharaoh's latest grand project, there was a high probability that a meticulous scribe with his palette and reed pens had already captured the essence of your transgression in the elegant, enduring curves of hieratic or demotic script. Your petty theft. Your small act of disrupting Maat was now a documented fact. A tiny indelible stain on the vast orderly papyrus scroll of ancient Egyptian life, awaiting the inevitable decision of the council and the subsequent restoration of balance. The diligent scribes of ancient Egypt, as you now know, with their reed pens poised over rolls of papyrus or handy ostraca, were always ready to document the slightest tear in the fabric of Maat. Their records speak of grand pronouncements and monumental constructions, but they also faithfully note the more mundane, everyday transgressions, including those countless instances of petty theft that nipped at the edges of social order. But what exactly constituted petty theft in this ancient land of pharaohs and pyramids? And what was the real price of, say, a stolen fig, a purloined pot, or a filched fish when weighed on the grand scales of divine justice and communal harmony? When you hear petty theft, you might imagine something fairly trivial, almost inconsequential. But in ancient Egypt, where many ordinary people lived close to the margins of subsistence, where a craftsman's tools were his livelihood, and where a family's store of grain might be the difference between a full belly and a hungry winter, even the theft of seemingly small items could have a surprisingly significant impact. It wasn't always about the grand monetary value of the object in a way a modern accountant might assess it. It was about the immediate, tangible loss to an individual or a household and the disruption it caused to their daily lives and their sense of security. It wasn't exactly Ocean's 11 meticulously planning to knock off the local temple treasury for a few extra handfuls of sacred barley. That would be a whole different level of trouble. But for the farmer, whose few measures of barley were pilfered from his small storeroom, it was a very serious blow indeed. So, what kind of items commonly tempted these ancient Egyptian sticky fingers? A mainstream historical fact is that petty theft frequently involved the pilfering of essential everyday goods. Foodstuffs were prime targets, as you might expect in any society where hunger could be a frequent visitor. This could be anything from grain, emmer wheat, or barley, siphoned from a granary or a neighbor's storage jar, to loaves of bread snatched from a baker's stall, to vegetables like onions, garlic, or cucumbers taken from a carefully tended garden plot. A bunch of ripe dates, a string of dried fish, a jar of beer or wine left unattended. All could prove irresistible to someone with a pressing need or a momentary lapse in their commitment to ma'at. Forget just stealing your office mate's fancy pens. Stealing your neighbor's carefully cultivated patch of prize-winning leeks was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a serious breach of community standards and could lead to some very tearful and possibly painful repercussions. Linen was another commonly stolen item. In the Egyptian climate, linen clothing was essential. Cool, practical, and relatively easy to produce, but still representing an investment of labor and resources. A stolen tunic, a kilt, or even just a length of good quality linen cloth that could be used for clothing, bedding, or burial wrappings was a significant loss for an ordinary person. Tools, too, were frequent targets. For a farmer, the loss of his wooden hoe or his flint-bladed sickle meant he couldn't work his land. For an artisan, a carpenter, a potter, a stonemason, the theft of his specialized chisels, drills, or molds could bring his livelihood to a halt. These weren't just objects, they were the means of survival. Household goods also feature in the records of petty theft. Simple pottery vessels for cooking or storage, woven reed baskets. Small wooden stools or boxes, a measure of precious lamp oil. Even building materials like mud bricks, a bundle of reeds for thatching, or scarce pieces of timber could disappear from a construction site or a private dwelling. And while stealing a prized bull would certainly escalate beyond petty, the theft of a chicken, a few ducks from a pond, or perhaps a young goat might fall into this category, causing considerable distress and economic loss to its owner. The impact of these seemingly small thefts rippled outwards. For the victim, it meant immediate hardship, frustration, and a sense of violation. It could lead to family arguments, to suspicion cast upon neighbors, to a general erosion of trust within the close-knit communities of villages or urban neighborhoods. And of course, in the grand Egyptian scheme of things, each act of dishonesty, each instance of someone taking what was not rightfully theirs was another small chip away at ma'at, another moment where chaos or isfet gained a tiny foothold. The gods, it was believed, saw everything, and such disturbances to the divine order could not go unaddressed if the land was to continue to prosper under Pharaoh's rule. A quirky tidbit that sometimes emerges from the study of these minor crimes is the surprisingly high value or significance attached to items that might seem utterly mundane to us. For example, a pair of well-made reed sandals in a society where many went barefoot or wore very simple foot coverings could be a prized possession, and thus a target for theft. Or consider the theft of offerings left at the tombs of more humble individuals. Not the gold and jewels of the pharaohs, but perhaps small loaves of bread, jars of beer, or faience amulets left by grieving family members. This wasn't grand tomb robbery, but a kind of petty sacrilege preying on the provisions intended for the deceased in the afterlife, and thus an offense with both material and spiritual dimensions. Egyptologists still debate the precise economic and social thresholds that consistently differentiated what was formerly considered petty theft, typically handled by local Kenbet councils with punishments often focused on restitution and perhaps a beating from grand theft, which might attract the more severe attention of higher state officials and incur far graver penalties, particularly if the theft involved temple property, state goods, or violence. The motivations behind these everyday pilferings were likely as varied then as they are now. Genuine hunger and desperation undoubtedly drove many. The sudden opportunity of an unguarded moment might tempt others. Perhaps a simmering resentment or a desire for small revenge could play a part. But whatever the cause, the effect was a disruption, a small tear in the social and cosmic fabric. And it was the task of the community, its local councils, its scribes, and its system of justice to find a way to mend that tear, to address the harm, and to bring the scales of Ma'at back into balance, often through some rather peculiar and memorable forms of punishment, which we shall soon explore. Their most wanted list for local petty crime probably included recurring characters like Neferhotep, last seen making a suspicious detour past Ipe's fig tree. Approach with caution may be surprisingly fleet of foot and armed with a dangerously sweet tooth. So the scribes have sharpened their reed pens, their papyrus scrolls are at the ready, and the theft of your neighbor's prize-winning bunch of figs, or perhaps your own missing pottery jar, has been duly noted as a minor tear in the grand cosmic fabric of Ma'at. But who actually deals with these everyday instances of petty pilfering? You're unlikely to find yourself immediately frog-marched before Pharaoh himself, or even a high-ranking vizier in a grand judicial chamber for absconding with a loaf of bread. No, for the common folk and their common transgressions, justice in ancient Egypt was often a much more local affair administered by a council of respected community members known as the Kenbet. Imagine this. Instead of an imposing stone courthouse, the Kenbet often convened in a more accessible, familiar setting. A mainstream historical fact is that these local councils typically comprised respected village elders, local priests, minor officials, or simply prominent, well-regarded members of the community known for their wisdom and fairness. They might gather in the shade of a large ancient sycamore tree that had witnessed generations of village life, or perhaps near the gateway of the local temple, a space already imbued with a sense of sacred authority. Or in a more organized settlement, there might be a designated administrative building, or a simple open-air courtyard where such matters were heard. Their local courthouse, you might picture, was less towering marble pillars and judges in imposing robes, and more shady fig tree number 3, please bring your own reed mat for seating, and try not to let your goat wander off and nibble on Exhibit A during the proceedings. When you or someone you know has been a victim of petty theft, your fishing net has vanished. Your small store of beer has been mysteriously depleted, or your lucky scarab amulet has gone walkabout. You wouldn't typically call the equivalent of a national police force. Instead, you would bring your grievance before this local Kenbet. The accused would also be summoned. There were no fancy lawyers in flowing robes to argue your case with elaborate rhetoric. You, the accuser, would state your complaint directly. The accused would then have their chance to respond to deny the charge, or perhaps to offer an explanation or even an admission of guilt. Witnesses, if there were any, perhaps a neighbor who saw someone acting suspiciously, or someone who could vouch for the accused's character, would also be called upon to speak. Forget a formal jury of your peers. You effectively had a council of your village elders who probably remembered you when you were a small child attempting to pilfer dates directly from the community palm tree, so they likely already had a fairly good measure of your general character and propensities. The elders of the Kenbet would listen patiently to all sides. Their role was not just to judge, but also to mediate, to understand the full context of the dispute. They would ask questions, probe for inconsistencies, and draw upon their deep knowledge of local customs, unwritten community laws, and very importantly, their intimate familiarity with the people involved. They knew the families, the personalities, the local squabbles, and the economic realities of their community. This local knowledge was invaluable in trying to ascertain the truth in a situation where hard physical evidence beyond the missing item itself might be scarce. The discovery phase of an ancient Egyptian petty theft trial probably involved less DNA testing and more of Mrs. Merritt from down the lane saying, "Well, I did see young Nocht looking a bit too pleased with himself near where I last saw my best laundry beating stick last Tuesday." Tzak, followed by a lengthy and possibly quite animated discussion about the known stick-admiring tendencies of Nocht. The atmosphere of a Kenbet hearing, while serious, was generally aimed at finding a practical solution that would restore harmony within the community. The goal was to re-establish Ma'at on a local level. This often meant ensuring the victim was compensated for their loss, that the offender acknowledged their wrongdoing, and faced a consequence that was seen as just by the community, and that any bad feelings between the parties were as much as possible smoothed over. Decisions were typically reached by consensus among the council members after careful deliberation. This collective agreement gave their judgments a strong moral authority and made them more likely to be accepted by everyone involved. A quirky tidbit concerning these local councils is the possibility that some judgments or agreements were not always sealed with a complex written document, especially for very minor matters in smaller villages. Instead, the resolution might be marked by a public symbolic act, perhaps the offender and the victim sharing a ritual offering of bread and beer before the elders, or making a specific gesture of reconciliation like clasping hands with the council members as solemn witnesses. This public acknowledgement and symbolic mending of the breach would be just as binding in a social sense as any scribbled papyrus. The types of judgments a kenbet might hand down for petty theft were varied, and we'll delve into specific punishments in more detail soon. But you can imagine them ordering the thief to return the stolen item, often along with a penalty payment, perhaps double or triple the item's value. They might prescribe a certain number of strokes from a cane, the bastinado, to be administered publicly as a shaming and a deterrent. They could order a formal apology or require the offender to undertake some form of community service. For more persistent petty thieves, or if the theft was deemed particularly egregious for its context, like stealing from a temple storehouse, even if the items were small, the kenbet might impose harsher sanctions or even refer the matter to a higher authority if it was beyond their local jurisdiction. Egyptologists still debate the exact level of formal legal training or strict adherence to any universally applied written statutes, if such comprehensive codes existed for all minor civil and criminal matters throughout Egypt's long history among the diverse members of these local kenbet councils, versus the degree to which their day-to-day decisions were primarily based on deeply ingrained customary law, local precedent, accumulated common sense, and an overarching, pragmatic desire for ongoing community cohesion and the swift restoration of Ma'at. What is clear is that the kenbet was a vital institution. It provided accessible grassroots justice, ensuring that even the theft of a single fig didn't go unaddressed, that victims had a forum to air their grievances, and that offenders were held accountable in a way that ideally allowed for their eventual reintegration into the community once balance had been well and truly restored. The scene is set, you're before the local kenbet, that council of village elders and notables perhaps assembled under the shade of a venerable sycamore tree or within the sun-dappled gateway of the local temple. The accusation of petty theft has been made. Perhaps your neighbor Mararuka claims you've made off with his prize fishing net, the one he so painstakingly wove from palm fibers. You, of course, vehemently deny any such thing. Witnesses are few or their testimony is contradictory. How then does this council of wise but ultimately human adjudicators hope to arrive at the truth and ensure Ma'at is upheld? Well, in ancient Egypt, when mortal evidence reached its limits, they often turned to a power far greater, the gods themselves invoked through the solemn and perilous act of a divine oath. In a society where the divine was palpably present in every aspect of life, an oath was not merely a formal promise or a strong assertion of truth, as you might understand it today. A mainstream historical fact is that in ancient Egyptian legal proceedings, from the grandest state trials down to the most humble village disputes over a missing goat, solemn oaths invoking the names of major deities and the divine ruling, Pharaoh were a common and absolutely crucial element. To swear such an oath was to call upon the gods as direct witnesses and, more alarmingly, as enforcers of the truth. Lying under oath wasn't just a social faux pas or a minor legal infraction. It was considered a direct affront to the gods, an act that invited their swift and often terrifying retribution. Their version of swearing on a stack of Bibles involved invoking a whole pantheon of rather formidable deities, any one of whom it was firmly believed could make your afterlife considerably less pleasant, or even your current life rather abruptly shorter if you dared to cross them with a falsehood. So in your hypothetical case of the missing fishing net, both you and Mararuka might be called upon to swear. Mararuka, the accuser, might take a declaratory oath, perhaps standing before the elders, his hand raised, proclaiming something along the lines of, "As Amun-Ra, Lord of Thrones lives, and as the ruler, life prosperity, health always lives, this fishing net my finest was indeed stolen from my hut, and it is Nacht here who took it." The gravity of such a pronouncement invoking the king of the gods and the divine pharaoh would hang heavy in the air. Then it would be your turn. You, as the accused, would likely be required to swear an exculpatory oath, an oath of denial. This wasn't a casual "nope, wasn't me." It would be a formal, carefully worded declaration, often including a vivid self-curse, a statement of the terrible fate you willingly call down upon yourself if you are lying. You might declare, by the sacred waters of the Nile, by Ma'at, the goddess of truth, by the Ka of my ancestors, I did not take Mereruka's net. I have not seen his net. If I speak untruth, may a crocodile snatch me from the riverbank. May I have no children to honor my name, may my tomb be plundered, and my spirit find no peace in the west. You wouldn't just say, cross my heart and hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. It was more like, by the sacred ibis of Thoth and the potent magic of Isis, may my vital organs be repossessed by Anubis ahead of schedule, and my entry into the field of reeds be permanently denied if I'm fibbing about these alleged missing sandals. The specifics of the self-curse could be quite creative and personally terrifying. The very act of uttering such words, believing wholeheartedly that the gods were listening intently, and possessed both the power and the inclination to enforce these conditional curses, was a powerful psychological tool. It would take a very brave or very foolish individual to swear falsely when faced with the prospect of divine wrath. The choice of deities invoked could also add weight, perhaps calling upon the chief god of the local temple or a deity particularly associated with justice like Ma'at herself or Thoth the divine scribe and arbiter. The willingness or unwillingness of a party to take such an oath could often be the deciding factor in a case where other evidence was lacking. If Mereruka swore his accusatory oath with conviction, and you knocked, then hesitated, stammered, or outright refused to swear, your oath of denial, the Kenbet would very likely take that as a strong indication, if not an outright admission of your guilt. Conversely, if you swore your innocence with firm conviction, invoking powerful gods and dire self-curses, and Mereruka perhaps seemed less certain or unwilling to match the intensity of your oath, the balance of probability might shift in your favor. A quirky and rather telling tidbit about these oaths is the precise, often formulaic language that was sometimes used, and the belief that any deviation, any slip of the tongue could invalidate the oath or even signal deception. Scribes might even have model oath formulas recorded for reference. And the perceived consequences of false swearing were not to be trifled with. Beyond the immediate fear of supernatural punishment in this life, sudden illness, accidents, loss of property, the death of livestock, there was the even greater terror of what awaited in the afterlife. To die with a false oath on your soul was to risk failing the ultimate judgment before Osiris, your heart heavy with deceit and being condemned to utter oblivion, devoured by the monstrous Ammit. Lying under oath. Generally a very, very bad idea. The gods, it was widely believed, had exceptionally good hearing, an impeccable memory for falsehoods, and a rather dramatic flair for enacting poetic if unpleasant justice, especially if those falsehoods concerned something as vital as, say, the correct ownership of 3 plump ducks. Egyptologists still debate the exact psychological and social mechanisms that rendered these divine oaths so consistently compelling within the ancient Egyptian legal framework, whether it was predominantly a profound and literal fear of immediate tangible divine retribution from the gods, or if the equally potent threat of social shame, utter loss of reputation, and communal ostracism associated with being widely perceived as a deliberate oath-breaker and a defiler of Ma'at played an equally, if not more significant role in ensuring their general efficacy in compelling truth. What is certain is that in the world of ancient Egyptian justice, especially when dealing with the murky uncertainties of petty theft, where clear proof was often elusive, calling upon the gods to bear witness and to guarantee the truth was not a mere formality. It was a profound and deeply serious act, one that brought the full weight of the cosmic order, the power of Ma'at, and the terrifying potential of divine anger to bear on even the smallest of human disputes and transgressions, ensuring that the path to justice, however humble the case, was always trodden under the watchful eyes of heaven. The weight of those divine oaths, as you've now felt in your imagination, hung heavy in the air of the ancient Egyptian Kenbet, or local council. The fear of supernatural retribution from the gods, coupled with the very real social consequences of being seen as an oath-breaker, often served as a powerful compulsion towards truth. But what happened when the oaths were conflicting, when evidence was still murky, or more commonly, when guilt for a petty theft was established? Perhaps even through your own reluctant confession under the intense scrutiny of the elders and the invocation of mighty Amun-Ra. Well, then it was time for the more tangible and often quite painful consequences to be administered. And one of the most common, almost routine physical punishments for petty pilferers in ancient Egypt was a rather memorable experience known as the bastinado. Now the term might sound somewhat exotic, but the practice itself was brutally simple. It involved beating the soles of the offender's feet with a rod or cane. A mainstream historical fact is that the bastinado was a standard form of judicial corporal punishment in ancient Egypt, employed for a wide array of offenses beyond just petty theft. Things like minor insubordination, shirking corvée labor, or even failing to pay your taxes on time could earn you this unenjoyable attention. You might wonder why the soles of the feet. Well, from a grimly pragmatic perspective, it was an effective choice. It's an incredibly sensitive area, so the pain inflicted would be intense and immediate. It could temporarily incapacitate you, making it rather difficult to walk or run away for a while, yet it was less likely to cause permanent crippling injury or death compared to blows delivered to the torso or head. This meant that after a suitable period of painful reflection on your misdeeds, you could in theory be returned to the workforce, perhaps a little sore, a little wiser, and hopefully a lot less inclined to liberate your neighbor's property. Their version of a stern talking to often came with a complimentary and very unwelcome percussive foot treatment from a couple of rather enthusiastic officials wielding sturdy canes. Imagine the scene. Your guilt for, say, relocating a few measures of grain from the temple stores, or perhaps borrowing indefinitely a particularly attractive piece of linen from a market stall has been determined by the local kenbet. The sentence is pronounced a certain number of strokes. You would then be taken likely to a public or semi-public space, perhaps the same village square or temple gateway where the council met, because public visibility was a key component of the deterrent effect. You'd be forced to lie face down on the ground, or perhaps be held securely by attendants or guards, your feet bared and exposed. The official charged with administering the punishment, or perhaps a designated temple guard, or even in some cases your own master, if you were enslaved or indentured, would then proceed to deliver the blows with a long, flexible rod or cane. The number of strokes varied considerably depending on the perceived severity of your petty theft, your past record, if any, and the judgment of the council. Records from ancient Egypt sometimes meticulously note the exact number prescribed and delivered. Perhaps 10 or 20 strokes for a minor first offense, but it could go much higher potentially into the dozens for more serious or repeated pilfering. Each stroke would send a searing shockwave of pain through your body, a very direct and unforgettable lesson in the importance of respecting other people's belongings. It really gave a new and far less appealing meaning to the phrase, putting your foot down. Except in this case, it was usually someone else doing the forceful putting, and it involved a rather unyielding stick. The purpose of the bastinado was multifaceted. Firstly, of course, there was the element of pure physical pain, a swift and memorable retribution. Secondly, there was the public humiliation. Enduring such a punishment under the gaze of your fellow villagers or townsfolk, your neighbors, your family, perhaps even your children, was a deeply shaming experience designed to strip away your dignity and serve as a stark warning to all who witnessed it. And thirdly, it was about deterrence both for you and for the onlookers. The memory of that sting, that burning ache in your feet that made every step an agony for days afterwards, was intended to strongly discourage any future larcenous inclinations. A quirky, though perhaps not for the recipient tidbit, might concern the specific tools of the trade. While any sturdy stick could theoretically be used, there may have been preferences for certain types of wood or reed known for their flexibility and capacity to inflict a sharp sting, without necessarily breaking bones, assuming the wielder wasn't overly enthusiastic or deliberately cruel. Sometimes, if the petty thief was an employee of a temple or a large estate, it's possible their own overseer or a senior member of their work crew might have been tasked with delivering the punishment, a grim blurring of lines between official justice and the workplace discipline. Egyptologists still debate the precise social distinctions in the common application of the bastinado. For example, whether individuals of a slightly higher social standing within the commoner class, or perhaps women, were consistently less likely to receive this particular form of corporal punishment, or if they typically received a demonstrably lesser number of strokes for comparable petty offenses when compared to, say, male agricultural laborers or servants of the lowest status. For you, the unfortunate recipient, such academic distinctions would be cold comfort, as you limped away, your feet throbbing, the jeers or perhaps the pitying silence of the crowd still ringing in your ears. The bastinado was a very direct, very personal, and very painful way for ancient Egyptian society to reinforce its commitment to Ma'at. It was a clear message that even the smallest act of theft, the slightest disturbance to the established order, would be met with a response designed to make your souls sting, your pride crumble, and your desire to ever again appropriate your neighbor's prize-winning onions utterly and completely vanish. You'd certainly want to invest in some very thick-soled, divinely blessed sandals after one of those sessions. Or perhaps just develop a sudden intense interest in the spiritual benefits of levitation. The sting of the bastinado on the soles of your feet, that very direct and personal reminder of Ma'at's displeasure, might eventually fade. You might limp for a few days, reflecting on the unwisdom of your recent foray into petty theft, and perhaps resolve to be a model citizen henceforth. But what if your thievery was a bit more substantial than a few filched figs? What if you were a repeat offender, your name already familiar to the local kenbet and the diligent scribes? Or what if you simply couldn't make the restitution demanded of you? Well, then the ancient Egyptian justice system had other, more protracted, and arguably even more spirit-crushing punishments in its arsenal. You might find yourself sentenced to a period of arduous forced labor, perhaps taking a very involuntary career change into becoming a rock enthusiast, unwilling at one of Pharaoh's many monumental construction projects or in the sun-scorched quarries. Now it's important to distinguish this kind of penal labor from the general corvée duty that many ordinary Egyptian peasants owed to the state, for a certain period each year, often during the Nile's inundation. When agricultural work was impossible, much of the populace could be conscripted to work on vast public projects. Building pyramids in the Old Kingdom, raising dikes, digging canals, or hauling stones for temples. While this was undoubtedly hard work, it was a civic obligation, often with rations provided and a sense of contributing to the glory of Egypt and the gods. A mainstream historical fact, however, is that individuals convicted of various crimes, including more serious or repeated instances of theft, could be sentenced to a far more punitive and grueling form of forced labor, often in remote and inhospitable locations like state quarries or mines, under extremely harsh conditions with notoriously high mortality rates. This wasn't community service with a packed lunch. This was hard-time Egyptian style. Imagine the scene. Your sentence has been passed. You're marched off, perhaps in a gang with other unfortunates, away from the familiar sights and sounds of your village towards the desolate, shimmering heat of the desert where the quarries lie. These were the places where Egypt's magnificent stone, the limestone, sandstone, and granite that formed its temples and tombs, was hewn from the earth. The environment itself is a punishment. The relentless baking sun overhead, the choking dust that fills your nostrils and lungs with every breath, the sharp, unforgiving rock underfoot, and the profound lack of water or shade. Forget a gym membership for that chiseled physique. Hauling multi-ton stone blocks for Pharaoh's latest architectural marvel was the ultimate non-negotiable full-body workout with a strict no-quitting allowed clause, vigorously enforced by overseers wielding rather persuasive sticks. The labor itself is relentless and mind-numbingly repetitive. You might be tasked with quarrying the stone using primitive copper or bronze tools and stone pounders to chip away at the rock face, a slow, agonizing process. Or perhaps you're part of a team hauling massive, roughly shaped blocks on wooden sledges over rollers inch by painful inch towards the Nile, where they can be loaded onto barges. There are no modern safety regulations here, no hard hats or steel-toed boots. Accidents are frequent. Crushed limbs, broken bones, eyes lost to flying rock splinters. The overseers, often harsh taskmasters themselves, push you and your fellow laborers mercilessly using shouts, threats, and the ever-present sting of a whip or cane to extract every last ounce of effort. The conditions are appalling. Your rations are likely even more meager and of poorer quality than those given to general convicts in the settlements. Water is strictly rationed, a constant torment in the desert heat. Shelter at night, if any, would be rudimentary. Perhaps a few rough lean-tos offering minimal protection from the cold desert nights or the searing daytime sun. Disease would spread like wildfire in such crowded, unsanitary, and malnourished conditions. They probably didn't have an Employee of the Month award in the quarries. More like convict who has somehow managed not to collapse from heat stroke or a falling rock this particular week. The grand prize was likely just the dubious honor of getting to do it all again tomorrow. The psychological toll of this kind of existence is immense. The work is not only physically crushing, but often devoid of any personal meaning or satisfaction for you, the laborer. You are an anonymous cog in a vast impersonal machine, your individual suffering of no consequence to the grand designs of Pharaoh. Hope for release might be slim, especially if your sentence is a long one or for the duration of the project, which could mean years. The sheer monotony, the endless repetition of backbreaking tasks, the constant presence of harsh discipline, and the ever-present specter of injury, illness, or death all conspire to grind down your spirit. A quirky, though not particularly cheerful tidbit might be the way convict laborers were sometimes organized and identified. Perhaps specific work gangs were given particular unflattering names, or individuals might have been marked or branded in some way, especially if they were considered an escape risk to distinguish them as penal laborers. Imagine being part of the Scorpion Gang or the Weary Donkeys. Your only identity a mark of shame and a tool for the overseer's convenience. Egyptologists still debate the precise legal distinctions and day-to-day practical differences between the experiences of temporarily conscripted corvée laborers fulfilling a civic duty on state projects, and those individuals enduring penal forced labor as a direct consequence of a criminal conviction, particularly concerning their rations treatment by overseers, the typical duration of their service, and any realistic possibility of eventual release or social reintegration for the latter group. For you, sentenced to this quarry's heavy toll for your past thievery, such distinctions would be cold comfort. Your life becomes a cycle of brutal effort, minimal sustenance, and constant supervision, all under the vast and different Egyptian sky. The magnificent temples and tombs that rise across the land, testaments to Pharaoh's power and the glory of the gods, are built in part upon the sweat, the blood, and the broken spirits of countless individuals like yourself whose petty crimes led them to this unforgiving world of forced labor. A long, slow, and grinding punishment far removed from the quick sting of the bastinado or the public shame of the marketplace. The crushing, sun-baked toil of the quarries, or Pharaoh's grand construction sites, as you've just imagined, represented one particularly grim path for those whose petty thievery was deemed to warrant about it more than just a swift beating or a public shaming. It was a punishment that consumed your time, your strength, and often your hope. But alongside, or sometimes even preceding, such physically demanding sentences, ancient Egyptian justice had another fundamental principle at its core when it came to dealing with theft: the concept of restitution, of making good the harm done. And this wasn't just a simple case of give back what you stole. Oh no. The ancient Egyptians had a rather more robust and financially memorable approach to ensuring that a thief truly understood the cost of their actions. A system you might call payback plus a rather hefty penalty. A mainstream historical fact is that a cornerstone of ancient Egyptian law concerning theft from the Old Kingdom right through to Roman times was the requirement for the guilty party to make restitution to their victim. Simply punishing the thief, whether with the bastinado or a period of forced labor, didn't necessarily restore mayat for the person who had lost their property. To truly rebalance those cosmic scales, the loss had to be made good. And the Egyptians, in their practical wisdom, figured that if a thief had to pay back significantly more than they had taken, it would serve as both a powerful deterrent and a more satisfying resolution for the wrong party. Their returns policy for stolen goods was remarkably strict. You must return the item or its equivalent value, plus a significant inconvenience fee comprising several more identical items you didn't actually steal, and also please prepare to hand over a sizable portion of your dignity, which by the way is entirely non-refundable. So how did this payback plus penalty system work? Typically, if you were found guilty of stealing, say, a measure of grain, a linen tunic, or a craftsman's tool, you wouldn't just be ordered to return that single item. The kenbet or the presiding officials would often decree that you had to repay the value of the stolen goods multiple times over. This multiplier could vary. For ordinary petty theft between commoners, it might be twofold or threefold the original value. If, however, your theft was from a more sacred or powerful entity like a temple storehouse or state property, the multiplier could be dramatically higher, sometimes tenfold, 30-fold, or in some texts, even 100-fold for particularly egregious or sacrilegious thefts. Forget incurring late fees at your local library. Imagine the astronomical late fees if you were caught borrowing a sacred goose that belonged to the Temple of Amun. You'd probably be paying that one off in barley and good deeds for several generations of your family. Now in an economy that for much of Egyptian history relied heavily on barter, and where coined money wasn't widely used until very late periods, assessing the value of, say, a stolen pottery jar or a missing fishing net, and then calculating its twofold or threefold restitution could get a bit complex. Values were often reckoned in terms of common commodities like grain, especially barley or emmer wheat bread beer, or sometimes in units of weight of copper or silver, known as deben or sinew, even if actual metal pieces didn't always change hands for small transactions. Scribes would have been kept busy calculating these equivalents, ensuring that the restitution was fair according to customary values, yet still appropriately punitive. And who received this multiplied restitution? Primarily, it went to the victim, the person whose property had been stolen. This was a crucial aspect of restoring their personal sense of justice and making them whole again, or even slightly better off for the trouble and distress caused. If the theft was from a temple or a state institution, then that institution would be the beneficiary of the significantly amplified repayment. But what if you, the convicted petty thief, were utterly destitute? What if you simply didn't have the means to repay 2 goats when you'd only stolen 1, let alone 30 measures of grain? If you'd pilfered from a temple silo, this is where the other forms of punishment you've already encountered would likely come into play with renewed force. Your inability to make material restitution could very well lead to a harsher sentence of the bastinado, or as we saw in the last section, consignment to a period of forced labor. In essence, you might be forced to work off your debt to society or to the specific victim through your own toil, often under conditions that made repaying anything a very long and arduous prospect. Sometimes, the thief's family might also be held accountable, expected to contribute towards the restitution payment, another example of that strong sense of collective responsibility that permeated Egyptian society. It's like ancient Egypt had its own version of a very persistent and rather intimidating debt collection agency, but instead of just threatening your credit score, they had the authority to consign you to a quarry or ensure your feet became intimately acquainted with a sturdy cane if you didn't manage to cough up those extra 3 goats you now owed. The social implications of this system were significant. For the victim, receiving multiplied restitution could bring a genuine sense of closure and a feeling that justice in a very tangible way had been served. For you, the thief, the obligation to repay, often over a considerable period, was a constant public reminder of your transgression. It was an economic burden that could impact your entire household, and the shame associated with being so indebted would have been a powerful social sanction in itself. A quirky and perhaps telling aspect of this system is the way it underlines the deep respect for property, even relatively humble possessions within Egyptian society, and the understanding that theft caused a wound that required more than just the return of the item to heal. The plus penalty part was the societal ouch tax, the communal fine for having disturbed Maat and inconvenienced your fellow Egyptians. Egyptologists still debate the precise consistency and methodologies of how these restitution multiples were applied across different historical periods, various social classes in diverse geographical regions of ancient Egypt, and whether the primary driver was always true compensation and deterrence, or if in certain contexts, such as thefts from powerful institutions, it also served as a significant, if indirect, revenue-generating or resource-accumulating mechanism for those entities. What is clear is that the principle of payback plus penalty was a deeply ingrained feature of how ancient Egyptians dealt with petty thieves. It wasn't just about punishing the body or shaming the spirit, it was about hitting the offender where it often hurt most in a practical sense, their meager resources, and in doing so, ensuring that the scales of Maat were not just rebalanced, but perhaps tipped a little extra in favor of the wronged, as a clear lesson to all. The obligation to pay back what you stole, often several times over, as you've now understood, was a significant and economically painful consequence for any petty thief in ancient Egypt. That system of payback plus penalty certainly hit you where it hurt. Your meager resources, your ability to provide for yourself and your family. But the ancient Egyptian pursuit of Ma'at, of restoring that crucial social and cosmic balance, didn't just stop at your purse or your grain sack. Oh no. They also had a keen understanding of the power of public opinion, the sting of communal disapproval, and the sheer, unadulterated discomfort of being made a spectacle of your own foolishness. So, alongside or sometimes even as part of your material restitution, you might find yourself taking a starring, if entirely unwilling, role in the marketplace of mockery. The various public shaming rituals designed to teach you and everyone watching a very memorable lesson. In a society like ancient Egypt, especially within the close-knit confines of a village or a crowded urban neighborhood, your reputation, your good name, was an incredibly valuable, if intangible, asset. It influenced how people treated you, whether they trusted you in trade, whether they'd support you in times of trouble. To lose face, to be publicly disgraced, was a severe social penalty in itself. A mainstream historical fact is that public shaming was indeed a recognized and deliberately employed component of the ancient Egyptian justice system, particularly for offenses like petty theft, minor fraud, or public disturbances that weren't deemed serious enough for the harshest physical punishments or permanent banishment, but still required a visible and communal condemnation. Their version of being publicly called out on Twitter was considerably more immediate, involved actual physical presence, a live vocal audience, and a distinct and regrettable lack of an edit or delete button for your transgression. So imagine your petty crime, perhaps filching some tools from a temple workshop, or being caught with a neighbor's prized fat goose under your arm, has been proven before the Ken Bet. Your sentence might include, in addition to restitution, and perhaps a taste of the bastinado, a period of public exposure. One common method was a formal public denunciation. A local official, a temple herald, or even a respected elder might stand in a prominent place like the village square, or the bustling marketplace and loudly proclaim your name, your crime, and the judgment passed against you. Everyone would know what you did. There'd be no hiding it, no sweeping it under the reed mat. Even more direct was the practice of parading the offender through the streets. You might be forced to walk, perhaps with your hands bound through the very community you had wronged. And to make absolutely sure everyone understood the nature of your misdeed, you might be compelled to carry the item you stole. That fishing net, those onions, that unfortunate goose who by this point might be looking even more disgruntled than you are, or a wooden placard. A kosatsu-like sign might be hung around your neck with your crime crudely written upon it in hieratic script for those who could read, and probably verbally explained with great relish by those who couldn't to those who hadn't yet heard. Forget a quiet walk of shame after a minor social blunder. This was the officially sanctioned, government-sponsored full community participation, grand parade of he who really shouldn't have tried to nick that duck. During this procession, or if you were made to stand or sit in a designated spot of public ignominy, perhaps near the town gate or by the river landing, the community itself became an active part of your punishment. You would be subjected to the full force of their disapproval. Jeers, taunts, mocking songs, shouted insults, all would rain down upon you. Children, perhaps less inhibited, might point and laugh. Adults would stare with contempt or shake their heads in osujdanie. Condemnation, but let's stick to English for the main text or disappointment. This wasn't just random heckling, it was a communal expression of outrage, a collective reinforcement of social norms. It was their way of saying, this behavior is not acceptable here. You have disrupted Mayat, and we are all witnesses to your shame. You'd get a public review of your actions, all right. 0 stars. Would not recommend this individual for any future opportunities involving unsupervised access to, well, pretty much anything of value. A quirky and rather illustrative tidbit is that sometimes the shaming was made even more pointedly symbolic. For instance, if you stole grain, you might be paraded with a heavy sack of grain. Perhaps even heavier than what you stole on your back, or if you stole, say, onions, you might be temporarily adorned with a rather unflattering necklace made of decaying onions, ensuring that your crime was not only seen but also quite possibly smelled by all. The creativity involved in some of these shaming displays could be quite something. The psychological impact of these rituals would be immense. The intense embarrassment, the burning humiliation, the feeling of being utterly exposed and scorned by people you had to live alongside every day. This could be a far more profound and lasting punishment for some than a physical beating. It damaged your honor, the honor of your family, and made your future interactions within the community fraught with difficulty. Egyptologists still debate the precise balance and interplay between the formally prescribed elements of these public shaming rituals, as dictated by local courts or officials, versus the extent to which they also incorporated more spontaneous, community-driven expressions of outrage and moral policing that were simply permitted or channeled by the authorities as a recognized part of the justice process. The duration of such public exposure could vary from a few hours to a full day or even longer depending on the offense. Afterwards, you would be released, but the shame would cling to you. You would be that person who stole for a long time to come. The aim was that this social stigma, this memory of collective mockery, would be a powerful deterrent against any future lapses in judgment. It was a very public way of trying to ensure that once Ma'at was restored through restitution or other penalties, the offender was also given a very clear, very memorable social lesson in the price of dishonesty, delivered not by a single official, but by the 1,000 judging eyes of their entire world. The public denunciation, the humiliating parade through crowded streets, the uncomfortable hours spent in the stocks or pillory, these rituals of communal shame, as you've now witnessed, were designed to leave a powerful, if temporary, imprint on the mind of the petty thief and the memory of the community. The aim was to correct, to deter, and to restore social harmony through a shared sense of disapproval. But what happened if you were a particularly persistent pilferer? What if the sting of the bastinado, the burden of restitution, or the heat of public mockery simply didn't teach you the error of your ways? For such habitual offenders, or for those whose petty thefts began to accumulate into a more serious pattern of disrespect for Ma'at, ancient Egyptian justice had recourse to even more lasting and visible forms of condemnation, the indelible mark of the thief, while not perhaps as universally applied for every minor filcher. As some other punishments, the concept of permanently marking a criminal was certainly known and utilized in ancient Egypt, especially for those who proved themselves to be incorrigible or whose crimes, even if individually small, cumulatively represented a significant nuisance or threat to social order. This wasn't just about a bad reputation that might eventually fade. This was about a physical, undeniable brand or tattoo that would announce your past transgressions to everyone you met for the rest of your days. Their version of a bad reputation could quite literally be etched onto your forehead or arm, made it exceptionally difficult to get a glowing reference for your next attempt at, say, becoming the trusted keeper of the village grain supply. A mainstream historical fact is that permanent marking such as branding or punitive tattooing irasami in a much later Japanese context. But the concept of punitive skin marking is ancient and cross-cultural, was indeed used in the ancient world, including Egypt, for certain categories of individuals. While most prominently documented for runaway slaves to identify them as property if caught, or for captives of war, there is evidence such as mentions in texts like the Papyrus Lancing, suggesting that thieves too could have their crimes reproduced on their skin by tattooing. For a society so concerned with order and identification, a permanent visible mark served as an undeniable lifelong stigma and a potent warning to all. If you were a habitual petty thief constantly dipping your fingers into your neighbor's baskets or the temple offering bowls, you might find yourself upgraded from the temporary discomfort of the bastinado to a much more enduring form of public notice. Imagine the scene, if you will. You've been caught one too many times. The local kenbet has exhausted its patience and its more common remedies. The decision is made, you are to be marked. The procedure itself, which we will not dwell on in its painful specifics, would have involved either the searing heat of a branding iron or the repeated pricking of the skin with needles to introduce a dark pigment, creating a permanent design. The location would be somewhere visible, perhaps the forehead rendering your shame impossible to hide, or an arm or shoulder still easily noticeable in the typical Egyptian kilt or tunic. You thought a really bad online review was hard to get rid of? Try explaining away a divinely sanctioned, officially applied, I have a demonstrable history of being a bit dodgy with other people's unattended property mark that steadfastly refuses to wash off no matter how much Nile mud you scrub on it. The symbols used might have varied. Perhaps a specific hieroglyph denoting thief or deceiver, or a simple geometric mark that was universally understood within the community to signify a convicted criminal. A quirky though chilling tidbit could be, if the mark itself was designed to be particularly humiliating or symbolic of the crime, imagine a tiny stylized depiction of a stolen fig or a pilfered fish permanently etched onto your person. Or perhaps the mark simply identified you as belonging to a penal work gang, your petty thievery having finally escalated to the point where you were considered state property to be deployed in the harshest labor. The social and psychological consequences of bearing such a mark would be devastating. You would be forever set apart, your past transgression an open book for all to read on your very skin. Finding honest employment would become incredibly difficult. Who would trust a visibly marked thief to handle their goods? mind their stall, or work in their household. You might be shunned by former friends and acquaintances. Your marriage prospects, if you weren't already married, would plummet, and your family would share in your disgrace. Children might point, adults would whisper. It was a constant, living reminder of your failure to live according to Ma'at. A punishment that renewed itself every time you caught your own reflection or saw someone's gaze linger. A moment too long on your marked skin. It really took wearing your heart on your sleeve to a whole new and rather unfortunate level. If your sleeve, or rather the arm beneath it, bore a permanent, officially sanctioned caution, prone to pilfering small unattended objects label, Egyptologists still debate the precise prevalence and specific forms of such permanent physical marking, whether branding or tattooing, for different categories of common offenders in ancient Egypt, particularly for those who were not slaves but free. Though low-status individuals convicted solely of petty crimes, versus its more clearly documented and widespread use for identifying and controlling state-owned laborers, captives of war, or frequently absconding slaves. For the habitual petty thief whose actions had exhausted the community's patience and the efficacy of lesser punishments, this mark of the thief was an ultimate earthly condemnation. It was a way for society to say, "We see you, we know what you are, and we will not forget." It transformed your body into a walking testament to your own disgrace, a permanent scar, not just on your skin, but on your place within the ordered world of ancient Egypt, ensuring that the shadow of your smallest misdeeds would follow you visibly for all your remaining days under the watchful eye of Ra. The indelible mark of the thief, that permanent, visible stain of branding or punitive tattoo we just considered, served as a lifelong reminder of past transgressions, especially for the habitual petty offender in ancient Egypt. It was a way for society to ensure that repeat troublemakers were easily identified, their history written on their very skin. But what happened when the thief wasn't known? What if your precious figs vanished from your garden, or your new linen tunic disappeared from the washing line by the canal? And despite your best efforts and the inquiries of the local Kenbet, no culprit could be definitively identified. When human evidence failed, when witnesses were silent or contradictory, and even the power of divine oaths hadn't brought clarity, the ancient Egyptians had another recourse, another avenue to seek truth and restore Ma'at. They could appeal directly to the gods themselves through the mysterious and often awe-inspiring process of an oracular consultation. Now, oracles in ancient Egypt weren't just for vaguely predicting whether next year's harvest would be good, or if Pharaoh's latest military campaign would be a stunning success. A mainstream historical fact is that oracular consultations played a surprisingly significant role in the actual administration of justice, especially from the New Kingdom period onwards, and could be used to resolve a wide range of difficult cases, including accusations of theft, where ordinary human investigative methods had reached a dead end. If the local council couldn't figure out who swiped your prize-winning sacred baboon's favorite chew toy, well, they might just decide to ask the god of the local temple directly. Considerably quicker than a lengthy forensic investigation, and the god probably didn't require a search warrant either. Imagine the scene. The Kenbet has deliberated over your case of the missing amulet, or your neighbor's pilfered pottery, and they simply cannot reach a firm conclusion. Suspicions might point in a couple of directions, or perhaps there's no clear suspect at all. To leave the matter unresolved would be to leave Ma'at unbalanced, the victim unsatisfied, and a potential thief still at large in the community. So the decision is made to put the question to the god. This usually involved a formal procession and a ceremony at the local temple, or sometimes even a more prominent state temple if the matter or the people involved were of higher status. One of the most common methods of obtaining an oracular verdict involved the cult statue of a deity. This wasn't just any statue, it was the consecrated image in which the god's spirit thereby was believed to reside or manifest, especially during festivals and processions. This sacred statue, often housed within a shrine or a model boat called a sacred bark, would be carried aloft on the shoulders of priests as the procession moved, or as it stopped before the gathered supplicants, questions would be put to the god. For a case of petty theft, the question might be very direct. O great Amun or Mut or Khonsu, or whichever deity was being consulted, was it Nacht who stole the sandals? Or perhaps to Asoria, those handy pottery shards, each inscribed with the name of a suspect, would be placed before the path of the divine bark. The god's answer would then be read through the movements of the statue as carried by the priests. If the bark and thus the statue tilted forward or nodded when a particular name was mentioned, or a specific question was asked, that was taken as an affirmative. If it recoiled or tilted backward, that was a negative. If there were two choices presented, the statue might cause the bearers to move towards one, indicating the god's selection. Their version of a divine lie detector test often involved a very large, very heavy, and presumably very insightful statue of a deity, a dedicated team of priestly statue lifters, and a whole community holding its breath, hoping the god wasn't feeling particularly indecisive or grumpy that day. The atmosphere during such an oracular procession would be one of immense solemnity, awe, and perhaps a fair bit of trepidation, especially if you were one of the individuals whose fate was about to be decided by the unseen inclination of a divine being. Incense would be burning, priests might be chanting, and the entire community might be present witnessing this direct appeal to the supernatural. A quirky tidbit is the sheer simplicity of the questions often posed, typically designed for a yes, no, or this one, that one response. There wasn't much room for, well, it's complicated, your divine godliness. The oracle provided clarity, one way or the other. You wouldn't just take your case to a higher court in the human sense. You were taking it to the highest conceivable court where the ultimate judge was quite literally a god, and their rulings were generally considered non-negotiable and probably came with zero practical appeal options, just the lingering potential for divine smiting if you argued too much. The verdict delivered by the oracle was generally considered binding and divinely sanctioned. If the god pointed to you as the thief of those figs, then, as far as the community and the legal system were concerned, you were the thief. The prescribed punishments, restitution likely multiplied as we've discussed, perhaps a bastinado public shaming, would then follow now with the added weight of divine confirmation of your guilt. It would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to argue against a judgment believed to have come directly from a deity. Of course, the priests carrying the bark, interpreting its movements, played a crucial human role in this process. Egyptologists still debate the exact mechanics and the degree of genuine popular belief in the absolute infallibility of these oracular pronouncements versus the undeniable potential for manipulation or subtle guidance by the temple priesthood or other powerful individuals who might have sought to use the oracle to legitimize predetermined outcomes. Settle old scores or reinforce existing power structures, especially in local disputes over seemingly minor matters like petty theft. However, for many ancient Egyptians, the oracle was a vital and trusted means of accessing divine wisdom and achieving justice when human means alone were insufficient. It provided a way to resolve intractable disputes, to identify hidden wrongdoers, and to restore Ma'at in a way that carried the ultimate spiritual authority. In a world where the gods were seen to be intimately involved in every aspect of life and death, it made perfect sense to consult them directly when the balance of truth and order had been disturbed, even by something as seemingly small as a stolen handful of dates. The unseen verdict of the oracle could determine your fate, your reputation, and your path to making amends, under the ever-watchful eyes of both your community and your gods. The indelible mark of the thief, that permanent visible stain of branding or punitive tattoo, we just considered served as a lifelong reminder of past transgressions, especially for the habitual petty offender in ancient Egypt. It was a way for society to ensure that repeat troublemakers were easily identified, their history written on their very skin. But what happened when the thief wasn't known? What if your precious figs vanished from your garden, or your new linen tunic disappeared from the washing line by the canal, and despite your best efforts and the inquiries of the local Kenbet, no culprit could be definitively identified? When human evidence failed, when witnesses were silent or contradictory, and even the power of divine oaths hadn't brought clarity, the ancient Egyptians had another recourse, another avenue to seek truth and restore Ma'at. They could appeal directly to the gods themselves through the mysterious and often awe-inspiring process of an oracular consultation. Now, oracles in ancient Egypt weren't just for vaguely predicting whether next year's harvest would be good, or if Pharaoh's latest military campaign would be a stunning success. A mainstream historical fact is that oracular consultations played a surprisingly significant role in the actual administration of justice, especially from the New Kingdom period onwards, and could be used to resolve a wide range of difficult cases, including accusations of theft, where ordinary human investigative methods had reached a dead end. If the local council couldn't figure out who swiped your prize-winning sacred baboon's favorite chew toy, well, they might just decide to ask the god of the local temple directly. Considerably quicker than a lengthy forensic investigation, and the god probably didn't require a search warrant either. Imagine the scene. The Kenbet has deliberated over your case of the missing amulet or your neighbor's pilfered pottery, and they simply cannot reach a firm conclusion. Suspicions might point in a couple of directions, or perhaps there's no clear suspect at all. To leave the matter unresolved would be to leave Ma'at unbalanced, the victim unsatisfied, and a potential thief still at large in the community. So the decision is made to put the question to the god. This usually involved a formal procession and a ceremony at the local temple, or sometimes even a more prominent state temple if the matter or the people involved were of higher status. One of the most common methods of obtaining an oracular verdict involved the cult statue of a deity. This wasn't just any statue, it was the consecrated image in which the god's spirit thereby was believed to reside or manifest, especially during festivals and processions. This sacred statue, often housed within a shrine or a model boat called a sacred bark, would be carried aloft on the shoulders of priests. As the procession moved, or as it stopped before the gathered supplicants, questions would be put to the god. For a case of petty theft, the question might be very direct. O great Amun or Mut or Khonsu, or whichever deity was being consulted, was it Nacht who stole the sandals? Or perhaps two ostraca, those handy pottery shards, each inscribed with the name of a suspect, would be placed before the path of the divine bark. The god's answer would then be rid through the movements of the statue as carried by the priest. If the bark, and thus the statue, tilted forward or nodded when a particular name was mentioned or a specific question was asked about, that was taken as an affirmative. If it recoiled or tilted backward, that was a negative. If there were two choices presented, the statue might cause the bearers to move towards one, indicating the god's selection. Their version of a divine lie detector test often involved a very large, very heavy, and presumably very insightful statue of a deity, a dedicated team of priestly statue lifters, and a whole community holding its breath, hoping the god wasn't feeling particularly indecisive or grumpy that day. The atmosphere during such an oracular procession would be one of immense solemnity, awe, and perhaps a fair bit of trepidation, especially if you were one of the individuals whose fate was about to be decided by the unseen inclination of a divine being. Incense would be burning, priests might be chanting, and the entire community might be present witnessing this direct appeal to the supernatural. A quirky tidbit is the sheer simplicity of the questions, often posed, typically designed for a yes, no, or this one, that one response. There wasn't much room for, well, it's complicated, your divine godliness. The oracle provided clarity one way or the other. You wouldn't just take your case to a higher court, in the human sense. You were taking it to the highest conceivable court where the ultimate judge was quite literally a god, and their rulings were generally considered non-negotiable and probably came with zero practical appeal options, just the lingering potential for divine smiting if you argued too much. The verdict delivered by the oracle was generally considered binding and divinely sanctioned. If the god pointed to you as the thief of those figs, then, as far as the community and the legal system were concerned, you were the thief. The prescribed punishments, restitution likely multiplied, as we've discussed, perhaps a bastinado public shaming, would then follow now with the added weight of divine confirmation of your guilt. It would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to argue against a judgment believed to have come directly from a deity. Of course, the priests carrying the bark and interpreting its movements played a crucial human role in this process. Egyptologists still debate the exact mechanics and the degree of genuine popular belief in the absolute infallibility of these oracular pronouncements versus the undeniable potential for manipulation or subtle guidance by the temple priesthood or other powerful individuals who might have sought to use the oracle to legitimize predetermined outcomes, settle old scores, or reinforce existing power structures, especially in local disputes over seemingly minor matters like petty theft. However, for many ancient Egyptians, the oracle was a vital and trusted means of accessing divine wisdom and achieving justice when human means alone were insufficient. It provided a way to resolve intractable disputes, to identify hidden wrongdoers, and to restore Ma'at in a way that carried the ultimate spiritual authority. In a world where the gods were seen to be intimately involved in every aspect of life and death, It made perfect sense to consult them directly when the balance of truth and order had been disturbed, even by something as seemingly small as a stolen handful of dates. The unseen verdict of the oracle could determine your fate, your reputation, and your path to making amends under the ever-watchful eyes of both your community and your gods. Section 12. The oracle, with its mysterious pronouncements, believed to echo the very will of the gods, might have been your last hope, or your ultimate undoing in a tricky case of petty theft where human evidence fell short. The divine verdict once delivered was almost unassailable, setting in motion the prescribed penalties to restore Ma'at. But as you navigate this ancient Egyptian world, you begin to realize that not all petty thefts are created equal in the eyes of the law, or indeed in the eyes of those powerful, ever-watchful deities. There's a profound difference between, say, filching a few onions from your neighbor's garden patch and daring to steal something, anything, no matter how seemingly insignificant, from the sacred precinct of a temple, the very house of a god. This, you learn, is treading on an entirely different level of dangerous ground. Ancient Egyptian temples, as you've surely glimpsed, from their towering pylons and massive columned halls, were far more than just places for daily worship or grand festivals. A mainstream historical fact is that they were colossal economic engines, some of the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in the land. Major temples owned vast tracts of agricultural land, enormous herds of cattle workshops producing fine linens, pottery, and metalwork, extensive granaries and treasuries often filled with offerings of gold, silver, precious stones, incense, wine, and the finest oils. All of this wealth was considered the direct property of the god or goddess who resided within that temple. The priests and temple staff were merely its stewards, its administrators. Therefore, to steal from a temple even a seemingly minor item, a small offering left by a pilgrim, a tool from a temple artisan's workshop, a measure of grain from the sacred granary, or even just a few choice figs from the god's own orchard, was not merely an act of theft. It was an act of sacrilege, a direct affront to the deity, a profound violation of their sacred trust, and a grievous disruption of Ma'at that invited consequences far more severe than ordinary pilfering. Thinking of pocketing that shiny little faunt's amulet from the offering table in Amun-Ra's great temple? Extremely bad idea. The gods, it was widely understood, had an impeccable inventory system maintained by legions of diligent and probably rather humorless divine accountants, and their auditors were notoriously unforgiving. So if your unfortunate foray into petty thievery involved, say, helping yourself to a few choice cuts of meat from the temple's sacrificial stores, or liberating a particularly nice piece of incense that was clearly earmarked for the god's personal enjoyment, the local Kenbet might still be involved initially, but the stakes would be instantly and terrifyingly higher. The punishments you might face would likely be amplified dramatically. Remember that system of payback plus penalty we discussed, where a common thief might have to restore 2 or 3 times the value of what they stole for temple theft? That multiplier could skyrocket. Texts suggest that restitution for stolen temple property could be demanded at rates of 10-fold, 30-fold, or in some cases even 100-fold or more. Imagine trying to repay 100 times the value of a few jars of sacred honey. You and probably your entire extended family for the next several generations would be in serious long-term economic distress. And the physical punishments, while a few strokes of the bastinado might have been deemed sufficient for snatching your neighbor's sandals, stealing from a god's house could see that number increase substantially, the blows delivered with a particular righteous fury. The chances of being sentenced to a long, hard stint of labor in the state quarries or mines, as we explored earlier, would also be much higher, perhaps with the added indignity of being specifically assigned as a slave of the temple. You had wronged your labor, now directly benefiting the deity you had offended for a very, very long time. In the most egregious cases of temple desecration or theft of highly sacred objects, even if those objects were small, the death penalty was not out of the question. Though for truly petty amounts, this might be reserved for repeat offenders or those who showed no remorse. Stealing from a god, you see, wasn't just a simple crime against property. It was a personal insult lodged directly with the celestial customer service department, and their response times and the severity of their solutions were often terrifyingly efficient. The investigation into a temple theft would also likely be far more rigorous. Temple officials, priests, and perhaps even higher state authorities would become involved. The search for the culprit would be pursued with greater zeal, and the pressure to find and punish the offender would be immense, not just to recover the god's property, but to purify the sacred space from the defilement of the act. A quirky and rather telling tidbit is that if a significant theft occurred within a temple, the temple personnel themselves, from the priests down to the cleaners, might have to undergo ritual purification ceremonies. It was as if the sanctity of the entire place had been violated, and everyone responsible for its upkeep shared a degree of spiritual contamination until the matter was resolved and the god appeased. The fear of divine wrath was, of course, a huge component of this. While stealing from a mortal might earn you a beating, from a mortal official stealing from a god was believed to invite the direct personal and often quite unpleasant attention of that deity. Misfortune, sickness, a terrible accident, or a cursed afterlife. These were the kinds of divine payback people genuinely feared if they dared to lay hands on sacred property. Their lost and found for items taken from temple property probably had a very special, very uncomfortable section reserved in the Duat, the underworld, for those individuals who found things a little too enthusiastically within the god's domain. Egyptologists still debate the precise legal and administrative frameworks that govern the vast economic enterprises of the major Egyptian temples throughout all periods, and whether the famously severe penalties for temple theft were consistently and uniformly applied across the board. For instance, to a high-ranking priest caught skimming offerings versus an opportunistic outsider, or a lowly temple servant. Or if, as in many human systems, social status. Connections within the powerful temple hierarchy or the specific political climate could sometimes subtly influence the investigation and the ultimate outcome of such sacrilegious transgressions. What remained constant, however, was the underlying principle: the property of the gods was sacrosanct. To violate that trust, even through what might seem like a minor act of pilfering, was to commit an offense of an entirely different magnitude. It was to risk not just the justice of men, but the far more formidable and enduring justice of the divine, ensuring that the price of that stolen sacred fig or that purloined piece of temple linen was astronomically and often terrifyingly higher than you could ever have imagined. The fear of divine retribution, as you've now come to understand, was a potent force in ancient Egypt, especially when it came to any transgression against the gods or their sacred temples. Stealing from a deity's house, even a seemingly minor item, invited consequences far graver than pilfering from your average mortal neighbor. But what about stealing something that, while perhaps small and petty in terms of its raw material value, was itself believed to be imbued with sacred or magical protective power? I'm talking about the ubiquitous amulets that nearly every ancient Egyptian, from the highest noble to the humblest farmer, wore or carried for protection, luck, and well-being. Surely an object designed to bring good fortune to its owner wouldn't turn on a new, albeit unlawful possessor, would it? Well, in the intricate belief system of ancient Egypt, the answer was often a resounding and rather unfortunate yes, it absolutely could. A mainstream historical fact is that amulets were an absolutely integral part of daily life and funerary belief in ancient Egypt. These weren't just decorative trinkets, they were considered potent objects charged with Heka or magical power, designed to ward off evil spirits, protect against sickness and accidents, ensure fertility, grant strength, or bring good fortune. You'd see them everywhere: the Ankh, symbol of life, the Djed, pillar representing stability, the sacred scarab beetle for rebirth and protection, the powerful eye of Horus, Ujat, for healing and wholeness, the Chet or Isis knot for protection, particularly for women and children, and countless figures of gods and goddesses like Bes, the dwarf deity, who protected households or Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess who guarded women in childbirth. These amulets were made from all sorts of materials: vibrant blue-green faience, semi-precious stones like carnelian lapis lazuli and turquoise, or even gold and silver for those who could afford it, but also simpler ones of wood, bone, or clay for the less affluent. Their power was believed to reside not just in their form, but in their symbolic meaning, and sometimes the rituals used to consecrate them. Now, imagine you're a petty thief, and you spot a particularly fetching lapis lazuli scarab amulet around someone's neck, or a finely crafted faience ankh left unattended. Its material value might be tempting enough. But what if you also believed even a little in its protective power? Perhaps you think that by stealing it, you could co-opt that magic for yourself. This is where the peculiar irony of the lost amulet's curse comes into play. It's like stealing someone's lucky rabbit's foot, only to discover that its luck was very specifically attuned to the original owner. And for you, it might just attract a whole plague of very unlucky, very large, and possibly quite vengeful spectral rabbits. The belief often was that an amulet's protective power was deeply personal, linked to its rightful owner. Perhaps through specific consecration rituals or simply through long association and the owner's own faith and life force. For a thief, then, this stolen magic might not only fail to work, but could actually turn malevolent. The deity whose power the amulet embodied, Horus Isis Bias, might take rather personal offense at their symbol being unlawfully acquired and used. Instead of protection, you might find yourself experiencing a sudden string of inexplicable bad luck accidents or illnesses. That stolen eye of Horus meant to ward off the evil eye might suddenly feel like it's giving you the evil eye 24/7. Their divine anti-theft system for magical jewelry wasn't just a sturdy clasp, it was the ever-present threat of a deity-grade magical backlash. Warning: the amulet might as well have invisibly proclaimed, "May cause sudden and inconvenient plagues of scorpions," or an inexplicable series of unfortunate hippopotamus-related incidents if handled by unauthorized sticky-fingered personnel. Beyond direct divine displeasure, there was also the idea that the amulet cut off from its rightful owner, and its proper ritual context could become inert, or worse, its protective energies could become twisted and harmful to the one who held it illicitly. It's like taking a sophisticated piece of spiritual technology and then using it without reading the divine instruction manual or having the correct spiritual password. The results are unlikely to be beneficial. Of course, there was also a very practical, psychological element to this. If you as the thief deeply believed in the power of amulets and the anger of the gods, then your own guilt, fear, and paranoia after stealing such an item could easily manifest as perceived misfortune. Every stubbed toe, every spoiled pot of beer, every unexpected encounter with an angry goose could be interpreted as the beginning of the amulet's curse taking effect. A quirky tidbit that enhances this idea is the belief that some amulets needed to be activated or regularly recharged through specific rituals, offerings, or incantations known only to the rightful owner or a priest on their behalf. A stolen amulet, therefore, would be like a spiritual battery running on empty, or worse one, that starts to leak corrosive bad luck all over the unfortunate new owner. There are even folktales from various cultures, though specific Egyptian ones would need pinpointing about thieves who steal magical items and then suffer bizarre fates directly related to the item's original purpose. Perhaps the thief who stole an amulet for easy childbirth finds himself with a never-ending stomachache. Egyptologists still debate the exact extent to which the perceived magical repercussions of stealing sacred or amuletic objects were genuinely believed by all echelons of ancient Egyptian society to operate as an automatic supernatural mechanism, versus the degree to which such beliefs were perhaps subtly encouraged, particularly by the priestly and elite classes as a powerful psychological deterrent to protect valuable personal and funerary property, which was often laden with such amulets. Naturally, if you were caught by more mundane means, having stolen an amulet, you would still face the standard array of punishments for petty theft. The potential for a bastinado. The requirement for restitution likely multiplied, especially if the amulet was of significant material or spiritual value to its owner, and public shaming. But the added layer of anxiety, the fear that the very object you pilfered was now actively working against you, turning your good fortune to bad, that was a uniquely Egyptian sort of peculiar punishment, a self-inflicted curse wrapped around a stolen blessing. You'd definitely think twice about nicking that shiny scarab beetle amulet if you knew it might not help you be reborn into a glorious afterlife, but instead just ensure your current life took a sharp, unpleasant turn towards being repeatedly and inexplicably dive-bombed by actual dung beetles. The thought of a stolen amulet turning against you, its protective magic curdling into a personal curse, might certainly give any would-be petty thief in ancient Egypt a moment's pause, a shiver of superstitious dread. It's a fine example of how deeply spiritual beliefs were woven into the everyday understanding of crime and consequence. But the ancient Egyptians, for all their reverence for the divine and the magical, were also eminently practical people, especially when it came to managing the vast wealth and resources of their temples, royal workshops, and great agricultural estates. They knew that while the fear of a god's wrath or a cursed object might deter some more mundane human systems of oversight, were essential to guard against the ever-present temptation of workplace pilfering. And so you encounter another layer of control, the watchful eyes and meticulous records of the properties, scribes, and their overseer colleagues. Imagine the sheer scale of operations in some of these ancient Egyptian institutions. A major temple like Karnak wasn't just a place of worship. It was a colossal economic enterprise owning thousands of acres of land, vast herds of cattle workshops producing everything from fine linen to sacred statues and granaries bursting with grain collected as offerings or rent. Royal construction sites like those for pyramids or new tomb complexes involved thousands of laborers and vast quantities of valuable materials. Copper tools, timber a precious commodity in Egypt, gypsum pigments. A mainstream historical fact is that in this highly organized, state-controlled economy, scribes and overseers were absolutely crucial for managing resources, meticulously tracking inventory, and implementing measures to prevent and detect theft by the legions of workers, artisans, and officials involved in these enterprises. Their version of an internal audit probably involved a very stern-faced scribe armed with a papyrus spreadsheet that could rival any modern Excel document for complexity, a keen eye for suspiciously missing copper chisels, and the undisputed authority to recommend a rather uncomfortable session of the bastinado for anyone whose accounts didn't quite add up. So, if you were a laborer on a temple estate, a craftsman in a royal workshop, or even just a peasant, delivering your quota of grain to the local silo, you were under constant, if sometimes subtle, scrutiny. The property scribe was the inventory master. His reed pen would be flying across papyrus scrolls or ostraka recording every sack of barley that came in, every measure of oil that was dispensed, every tool checked out from the storehouse, every finished product that left the workshop. These weren't just casual notes. They were often incredibly detailed lists, cross-referenced, and tallied, all designed to ensure accountability. Trying to sneak a few extra dates, or perhaps a handful of those shiny new faience beads you were supposed to be stringing past a diligent property scribe was like trying to sneak a sunrise past a particularly alert and officious rooster. Highly unlikely to succeed and probably going to result in a lot of uncomfortable squawking and official attention. Overseers and guards played their part too, of course in direct supervision. They would monitor the workers, ensuring tasks were completed, and also keeping a sharp eye out for any suspicious behavior, any attempt to conceal materials or finished goods. At the end of a workday, particularly in workshops dealing with valuable items like precious metals or fine linen, workers might be searched as they left the premises. There were no handy CCTV cameras back then, but a vigilant overseer with a good memory and a low tolerance for shrinkage could be just as effective, if not more intimidating. How is workplace theft typically uncovered? Sometimes it was through those meticulous scribal accounts. If the amount of grain recorded as received didn't match the amount in the granary, minus the recorded disbursements, an investigation would surely follow. If a certain number of copper chisels were issued to a work crew and fewer were returned, questions would be asked, and probably not very politely. Informers too likely played a role, just as they did in wider society. A worker hoping to curry favor or perhaps settling an old score might whisper a word to an overseer about a colleague's light-fingered habits. And sometimes it was simply a case of a blatant theft being witnessed directly. The consequences for being caught pilfering from your workplace, especially if that workplace was a temple or a state-run project, could be severe, often more so than for a similar value theft from a private individual. As you learned earlier, stealing from a god or from Pharaoh was a particularly grave offense. The restitution demanded would likely be much higher, the physical punishment more certain and perhaps more brutal. You could lose your position, whatever meager privileges it afforded, and find yourself demoted to the harshest forms of labor, or even branded and permanently assigned to a penal work gang if the theft was significant, or you were a repeat offender. Forget Employee of the Month awards. In the royal workshops or temple estates, the highest accolade you might aspire to was probably just employee who managed not to get accused of pilfering the sacred incense this week. And the prize continuing to have a job, however miserable. A quirky and very telling tidbit that highlights the concern over property control is the widespread use of seals in ancient Egypt. Doors to storerooms, granaries, tombs, and even humble containers like jars of wine or boxes of linen would often be secured with a mud seal impressed with a unique stamp from a cylinder seal or a signet ring, indicating ownership or official closure. If you, as a worker or guard, were found to have broken an official seal without authorization, or if goods went missing from a sealed context, you would be in a world of trouble. The broken seal itself was almost irrefutable evidence of a transgression. Egyptologists still debate the overall actual effectiveness of these ancient Egyptian accounting systems, and strict oversight measures in truly preventing widespread low-level petty pilfering by the thousands of workers engaged in large state and temple institutions, versus the distinct possibility that a certain baseline level of minor leakage of goods or materials was almost an endemic feature of the system, perhaps even tacitly tolerated by some pragmatic lower-level officials, as long as it didn't become too egregious, too blatant, or threaten the successful completion of major projects or the sanctity of sacred offerings. However, for you, the individual worker, the knowledge that your every measure of grain, every tool you handled, every finished product you helped to create was likely being counted, weighed, and recorded by a diligent scribe, and that your actions were being watched by sharp-eyed overseers added another powerful layer of deterrence against the temptation of petty theft. In the grand, highly organized economic machine of ancient Egypt, the property scribes and their vigilant watch were the unassuming papyrus-wielding guardians of Ma'at in the workplace, ensuring that even the smallest cog didn't illicitly grease its own axle at the expense of Pharaoh the gods or the communal good. Your journey through the sun-baked alleyways and papyrus-laden offices of ancient Egyptian justice has shown you a world where even the smallest misdeed, the most minor act of petty theft, was met with a fascinating and often rather pointed array of consequences. From the meticulous records of the ever-watchful property scribes to the divine pronouncements of oracles, from the sting of the bastinado to the shame of the marketplace mockery and the potential for a lifetime bearing the indelible mark of a thief you've seen. How seriously the disruption of order was taken. But as we reach the end of this particular exploration, you might find yourself pondering the ultimate aim of it all. Was this elaborate system of peculiar punishments purely about inflicting pain and deterring others through fear? Or was there a deeper, more profound purpose at play, the restoration of Ma'at, that all-important cosmic and social balance and the genuine healing of community harmony? A mainstream historical fact that weaves through our understanding of ancient Egyptian law is that their justice system, even when dealing with everyday petty crime, often embraced a dual purpose. Yes, there was undoubtedly a punitive element. The swift strokes of the cane, the public humiliation, the grinding toil of forced labor. These were certainly designed to make an offender suffer for their actions and to serve as a stark warning to anyone else who might be tempted to stray from the path of honesty. You wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of that kind of constructive feedback too often, that's for sure. Yet alongside this, and often deeply intertwined with it, was a powerful restorative impulse. The ancient Egyptians understood that a crime, especially theft, didn't just break a rule. It created a tangible harm to a victim and a rupture in the social fabric. Simply punishing the thief didn't magically make the stolen goods reappear or mend the broken trust between neighbors. And so, as you've seen, mechanisms like restitution, that payback plus penalty system, where the thief was compelled to restore often many times the value of what they stole, were absolutely central. This wasn't just about penalizing the wrongdoer, it was about making the victim whole again, about rebalancing the scales in a very material sense. Think back to the local Kenbet councils. Their deliberations, while serious, were often aimed at mediation, at finding a solution that all parties in the wider community could accept. The use of divine oaths wasn't just about trapping a liar. It was about bringing the profound weight of truth as sanctioned by the gods themselves into the proceedings so that any resolution would have a sacred legitimacy. Even the public shaming rituals, as uncomfortable as they were for the individual, also served a communal function. They allowed the community to collectively reaffirm its values, to express its disapproval of dishonesty, and then potentially to begin the process of allowing the shamed individual, once they had made amends, to slowly regain their place. It's like their entire justice system had a built-in element of group therapy, but with slightly more direct consequences if you didn't actively participate in your own social rehabilitation, and possibly involving a few more divinely mandated penalties. A quirky and rather insightful way to glimpse this underlying ideal is through texts like the Negative Confession, or more accurately, the Declarations of Innocence found in chapter 125 of the Book of the Dead. Here, as the deceased spirit stands in judgment before Osiris, And the 42 divine assessors, they must truthfully declare a long list of transgressions they have not committed in life to prove their worthiness for the afterlife. Many of these declarations relate directly to honesty and fair dealing. I have not committed theft. I have not filched the property of a god. I have not diminished the food offerings. I have not added to the weight of the balance, nor have I tampered with the plummet of the scales. The sheer detail and emphasis on such everyday ethical conduct underscores how deeply the principles of ma'at, truth, fairness, and respect for property, were ingrained as essential for a good life, and by extension, a good afterlife. Their final exam, it seems, had a very comprehensive section on not being a petty thief. Of course, the ideal of ma'at and the day-to-day reality of human justice could sometimes be two different things. The severity of a punishment, the thoroughness of an investigation, the fairness of a local council. These could all be influenced by the social status of those involved, the competence or corruption of local officials, or the particular political climate of the time. Egyptologists still debate the extent to which the ancient Egyptian legal system, particularly at the local Kenbet level, when dealing with the myriad of petty offenses that must have occurred daily consistently, and successfully achieved its lofty stated ideal of restoring ma'at and ensuring truly equitable justice for all members of society, versus the degree to which it might have in practice sometimes been swayed by factors such as social hierarchy, personal influence, patronage networks, or even the arbitrary exercise of power by local officials. Yet when you step back and look at the overall tapestry of these peculiar punishments for petty thieves, what emerges is a profound and enduring societal commitment to order, truth, and the restoration of balance. The methods might seem strange, even harsh to our modern eyes. The solemn oaths before unseen gods, the painful sting of the bastinado, the communal marketplace of mockery, the forced restitution of multiples, the ever-watchful eyes of the property scribes. But each in its own way was a tool designed not just to make an individual suffer for their misdeeds, but to reaffirm the sacred principles of Ma'at, to heal the rifts caused by dishonesty, and to ensure that the community, that vital lifeblood of ancient Egyptian civilization, could continue to function in harmony under the benevolent gaze of their gods and the steadfast rule of their pharaoh. The ultimate goal, it seems, was not just a land free of thieves, but a land where justice, truth, and cosmic balance were actively sought and as much as humanly possible maintained. Word count 1396. And so, as the sun sets metaphorically over the ancient land of the Nile and our exploration of its peculiar ways of dealing with even the smallest of transgressions comes to a gentle close, allow the intricate details of laws and judgments, of scribal scrolls and divine oracles to soften and drift away. The quest for Ma'at, for that perfect balance, has been a long one tonight. Imagine now, if you will, the deep velvet of the Egyptian night sky, unpolluted by modern lights, revealing a breathtaking tapestry of stars so close you feel you could almost reach out and touch them. The air is cool and still, carrying the faint, sweet scent of desert blooms, or the distant, earthy aroma of the Nile itself, a timeless presence. Perhaps you hear the soft lapping of its waters against the reeds, or the almost inaudible whisper of a breeze through the palm fronds. The bustling sounds of the day, the marketplace chatter, the overseer's call, the scribe's busy pen, have all given way to a profound and ancient quiet. Let this deep stillness envelop you. Feel the weight of the day, any lingering thoughts of judgment or consequence simply dissolve into the peaceful darkness. There are no more courts to attend, no more oaths to swear, no more penalties to endure. There is only this moment of calm, this invitation to rest. Allow your body to grow heavy, your limbs to relax, your mind to become as serene and untroubled as the surface of the Nile under a canopy of stars. Let your breath be a soft, gentle rhythm, like the river's eternal flow, carrying you effortlessly towards the deep, restorative embrace of sleep, where all is harmony and only peaceful dreams of timeless deserts and life-giving waters await. Having journeyed through the philosophical heart of ancient Egyptian justice, contemplating its ultimate aim of restoring Ma'at and healing the communal fabric after transgression, you might now find yourself wondering, how do we even know all of this? How do these tales of stolen figs, divine oaths, stinging bastinados, and meticulous property scribes reach us across the vast gulf of millennia? The answer in large part lies etched in stone, painted on plaster, and inscribed on papyrus, preserved for us by the ancient Egyptians' profound concern for life, death, and the eternity that lay beyond, much of it found as echoes from their tomb walls. It might seem a bit strange at first to look for records of everyday petty crime and punishment in places so dedicated to the afterlife, to eternal peace and abundance. Tombs, after all, were designed as houses of eternity for the deceased, intended to provide everything they would need to flourish in the next world. But a mainstream historical fact is that these funerary monuments, from the grand pyramids of kings to the more modest rock-cut tombs of officials, and even some artisans, are invaluable treasure troves of information about ancient Egyptian life, including their legal and social systems. The scenes and texts within were not just about an idealized afterlife. They often reflected, or at least selectively represented, the earthly experiences, achievements, and societal structures that the deceased wished to perpetuate or be judged favorably upon. It's like their tombs were not just eternal resting places, but also a combination of a meticulously curated social media profile, a very detailed CV, and a final performance review for the guy. So, as you wander in your mind's eye through the painted corridors of an ancient Egyptian tomb, what clues might you find about how they dealt with a pilfering peasant or a light-fingered laborer? Direct, lurid depictions of common punishments for petty theft are actually quite rare in the formal art of elite tombs. The focus there was usually on projecting an image of order, prosperity, and the deceased's own virtue. You're unlikely to find a full-color mural of Nacht getting his feet caned for borrowing Mararuka's fishing net next to a serene depiction of the tomb owner enjoying eternal banquets. That wouldn't quite fit the desired aesthetic of perpetual bliss. However, the clues are often more subtle, embedded in scenes of daily life administration and religious belief. You might see vibrant depictions of agricultural estates with overseers diligently watching laborers in the fields and scribes meticulously counting sacks of grain being brought into granaries. While these scenes emphasize abundance and good management, they also implicitly hint at the systems of accountability that were in place to prevent pilfering of that precious harvest. Any missing sacks would certainly have been noted by those sharp-eyed scribes, leading to the kinds of investigations and judgments we've discussed. Then there are the famous judgment scenes related to the afterlife. Most notably, the weighing of the heart ceremony from the Book of the Dead, often painted on tomb walls, or papyri buried with the deceased. Here you see the heart of the deceased being weighed on a giant scale against the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth and justice. While this is a post-mortem judgment, the negative confession, or declarations of innocence, that the deceased recites to prove their worthiness are a catalog of sins they claim not to have committed during their lifetime. And prominent among these are denials of theft and dishonesty. I have not stolen. I have not committed robbery. I have not purloined the offerings of the gods. I have not filched food. I have not tampered with the grain measure. I have not added to the weight of the balance. The very fact that these specific denials are so central to achieving a blessed afterlife tells you how seriously such transgressions, even seemingly petty ones, were viewed in earthly society. They were direct violations of Maat. Beyond the grand tomb, chapels of the elite, more direct evidence sometimes comes from the humbler records associated with the people who built these monuments, like the artisans and laborers of Deir el-Medina, the village of the workmen who constructed the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Ostraka. Those handy limestone flakes or pottery shards found in and around their village are covered in their everyday jottings, letters, laundry lists, work rosters, and yes, records of their own local Kenbet proceedings detailing disputes over tools, accusations of theft of small items, and the resolutions reached. These provide a wonderfully grassroots glimpse into how justice operated for ordinary people. A quirky tidbit is the inclusion of detailed servant statues or wooden models in many tombs, especially from the Middle Kingdom onwards. These depict entire scenes of daily life: bakers kneading dough, brewers filling jars, butchers preparing meat, women grinding grain, scribes at their palaces. While these were intended to magically provide for the deceased in the afterlife, they also reflect the organization and implicitly the oversight of labor on earthly estates. You can almost imagine a tiny model overseer making sure none of the model bakers are pocketing too much of the divine flour for themselves. Texts found within tombs, such as the biographical inscriptions of high officials, sometimes boast of their fairness and their role in upholding justice. A vizier might proudly proclaim that he judged between two litigants so that they were satisfied, or that he rescued the weak from the strong, and that he did not take a bribe. While these are, of course, self-laudatory statements designed to present an ideal image, they nonetheless reflect the societal value placed on just administration, even if the reality didn't always match the inscription. Egyptologists still debate how accurately the often idealized and formulaic scenes and texts found within elite funerary contexts truly reflect the complex day-to-day realities of the administration of justice for common people and the actual prevalence and specific nature of petty crime throughout the wider populace, versus presenting a carefully curated and somewhat sanitized image of perfect Ma'at-driven order, intended for the gods for posterity, and for the eternal comfort of the tomb owner. Nevertheless, these echoes from tomb walls, these fragments of papyrus and ostraca, these inscriptions carved in stone when pieced together, provide us with invaluable, if sometimes faint and filtered whispers from the past. They allow us to reconstruct, however imperfectly, the ways in which ancient Egyptian society grappled with the perennial human problem of petty theft, and how they sought through their peculiar blend of practical administration, communal pressure, physical chastisement, and profound spiritual belief to maintain the delicate balance of Ma'at in their land, ensuring that even the smallest theft did not go unrecorded, unaddressed, or unremembered, at least by the gods and their ever-diligent scribes. The echoes from tomb walls and the fragile whispers from papyrus scrolls, as you've come to appreciate, offer us precious if sometimes enigmatic glimpses into how ancient Egyptians confronted the everyday problem of petty theft. We've journeyed through their marketplaces of mockery, felt the imagined sting of the bastinado, and pondered the divine weight of an oracle's unseen verdict. As our exploration of these peculiar punishments draws to a close, you might find yourself contemplating the deeper currents that flowed beneath these ancient laws and customs, the enduring human quest for order and justice that the Nile itself seems to symbolize. For millennia, the Nile River, with its predictable life-giving annual inundation, was the very embodiment of Ma'at of cosmic order and cyclical renewal for the ancient Egyptians. It brought fertility out of the desert structure to the year and a sense of reliable rhythm to their existence. Yet just as the dark, chaotic waters of Nun, the primordial abyss, were believed to lie just beyond the ordered world, so too did the threat of Isfet. Chaos, injustice, and wrongdoing constantly nibble at the edges of their society. The entire complex system of Egyptian law, with all its peculiar punishments for even the smallest of thefts, can be seen as a monumental 3,000-year effort to emulate the Nile's gift of order, to irrigate the human landscape with the principles of Ma'at, and to keep those chaotic waters of transgression firmly at bay. It seems the ancient Egyptians were wrestling with the fundamental question of how do we stop people from nicking their neighbor's stuff and generally messing up the vibe, long before an apple caused significant trouble in another rather famous ancient garden setting. What is truly remarkable is the sheer longevity and adaptability of their approach. A mainstream historical fact is that the ancient Egyptian legal system, with its core emphasis on upholding Ma'at, its reliance on bureaucratic record-keeping by scribes, its use of local Kenbet councils for everyday justice, and its blend of often harsh punitive measures with deeply ingrained restorative principles like restitution, endured for an astonishing span of time, evolving through pre-dynastic times, the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, and on into the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. This enduring framework suggests a system that, for all its peculiarities, by our modern standards, was remarkably effective in maintaining social cohesion and a fundamental sense of order for one of humanity's longest-lasting continuous civilizations. Their societal operating system, let's call it Ma'at OS version 3000 Tollins, ran for an incredibly impressive uptime, even if some of its punishment subroutines were, shall we say, a trifle intense for the end user. When you look at the peculiar aspects, the divine oaths with their terrifying self-curses, the oracles that seemed to make statues nod, the multiplied restitution that could turn a stolen fig into a debt of a whole basketful, they all make a certain kind of sense within that ancient Egyptian worldview. If the gods were imminent, if Ma'at was a real active force, then invoking them in justice, fearing their retribution for false swearing, or seeking their guidance in uncertain cases was entirely logical. If property was essential for life and for one's afterlife provisions, then ensuring its return with a hefty penalty to discourage future attempts was a pragmatic way to protect everyone's interests. A quirky and rather charming insight into their ideals of justice can be found in their wisdom literature texts like the Instructions of Amenemhotep. These writings offer moral guidance for a well-ordered life, and they frequently emphasize fairness, honesty, and compassion, particularly towards the vulnerable. One maxim might advise, do not carry off the boundary of the field, nor shift the position of the measuring cord. Do not covet a cubit of land, nor violate the widow's boundary. Or another, do not associate with a man of violence. Do not let your heart be greedy. These aren't formal laws, but they reflect the ethical underpinnings of the legal system. The desired state of Ma'at in everyday human interactions, showing a deep concern for preventing the kinds of disputes and minor injustices, including petty theft, that could unravel the community. Egyptologists and legal historians continue to debate the precise degree of direct influence that ancient Egyptian legal concepts and specific practices might have had on the development of later legal systems in neighboring cultures of the ancient Near East and the wider Mediterranean world, versus instances where similar societal challenges simply led to parallel independent evolutions in how complex societies sought to define and administer justice. What is undeniable is that the ancient Egyptians grappled with timeless human problems: how to protect property, how to ascertain truth, how to resolve conflict peacefully, how to deal with those who transgress against communal norms, and how to balance the need for punishment with the possibility of reconciliation and the maintenance of social order. Their solutions, born from their unique environment and profound spiritual understanding, were sometimes harsh, sometimes surprisingly sophisticated, and always aimed at upholding that central sacred principle of Ma'at. Ultimately, whether it was through the all-seeing eye of a god, invoked in an oracle, the meticulous scroll of a village scribe, or the swift, stinging thwack of a cane on a deserving foot, the goal was clear: to keep the good ship Egypt sailing as smoothly and harmoniously as possible on the eternal life-giving Nile of cosmic order, and to gently, or not so gently, encourage everyone to refrain from rocking that very sacred, very important boat with too many illicitly acquired pomegranates or suspiciously borrowed fishing nets. And so, as the sun sets metaphorically over the ancient land of the Nile, and our exploration of its peculiar ways of dealing with even the smallest of transgressions comes to a gentle close, allow the intricate details of laws and judgments, of scribal scrolls and divine oracles to soften and drift away. The quest for Ma'at, for that perfect balance, has been a long one tonight. Imagine now, if you will, the deep velvet of the Egyptian night sky, unpolluted by modern lights, revealing a breathtaking tapestry of stars so close you feel you could almost reach out and touch them. The air is cool and still, carrying the faint, sweet scent of desert blooms, or the distant, earthy aroma of the Nile itself, a timeless presence. Perhaps you hear the soft lapping of its waters against the reeds, or the almost inaudible whisper of a breeze through the palm fronds. The bustling sounds of the day, the marketplace chatter, the overseer's call, the scribe's busy pen, have all given way to a profound and ancient quiet. Let this deep stillness envelop you. Feel the weight of the day. Any lingering thoughts of judgment or consequence simply dissolve into the peaceful darkness. There are no more courts to attend, no more oaths to swear, no more penalties to endure. There is only this moment of calm, this invitation to rest. Allow your body to grow heavy, your limbs to relax, your mind to become as serene and untroubled as the surface of the Nile under a canopy of stars. Let your breath be a soft, gentle rhythm like the river's eternal flow, carrying you effortlessly towards the deep, restorative embrace of sleep, where all is harmony and only peaceful dreams of timeless deserts and life-giving waters await.